John McMullen on 97.3 ESPN.com. Eagles in there. I was at the Eagles-Jets game, if you can call it a game, last night, as the Jets decided to put in some of their starters last night, John. And instead of getting a lot of Christian Hackenberg, you got to see Josh McCown get hit, and as Scott Grayson put in, him and I are both perplexed about the fact they put McCown back in the game.
Well, it is Josh McCown. It's not Joe Namath. So it's a 38-year-old journeyman, and the Jets need everything they can get as far as gaining some confidence for the season. But I'm pretty impressed with you guys putting together actual highlights from that game. I'm surprised you could find any.
There was a handful. There was a handful of moments. So, John, last night, let's start with what we saw from the Eagles in general. Doug Peterson didn't really have a great game plan, because I think in some ways he might have been thrown off a little bit by the fact the Jets put in those starters. But it might have been a blessing in disguise, because at least you got to see some guys who are on the bubble against some better competition.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously they're not going to game plan for the fourth preseason game, so that's not a concern. But, I mean, you can't control in the preseason what the other team is going to do. And people have different viewpoints and different ways how they want to handle it. I mentioned Kyle Shanahan admitted he game planned for his third game, which stunned me. I've never heard an NFL coach do that. I talked about Dom Capers in week one, all the blitzing he did. That's rare in the preseason environment. But guys are trying to accomplish different things, and they're trying to build confidence maybe on some bad units. And I think that's what you kind of saw with the Jets. And we'll see how it works out from then. But you can't be concerned with the other team. You have to do what you want to do. And obviously, Doug, first and foremost, wanted to make sure the starters and even a lot of key reserves were going to be healthy for week one in Washington, and that was the plan. And you get to see a bunch of backups and fighting for the last five positions or so on this team, and that's what we saw.
And of course, our segment Every Day with John McMullen being brought to you by Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. Visit Geno Pinto on the White Horse Pike in Hamilton, online at genopinto.com. Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. Scott?
Yeah, John, wanted to ask you about the as you put together the 53-man roster puzzle that every GM and coach is trying to do around the league today. I think with the Eagles, it's interesting to try to figure out what they do with backup quarterback. Do you, at this point, see any reason why Nick Foles will not be the number 2 quarterback, and that leads to Matt McGloin then, I think, getting cut? How about you?
Yeah, I can't see any way the Eagles keep 3 quarterbacks, and Matt McGloin just didn't do enough. And Nick warmed up. He dressed, and he was thrown a little bit before the game, and obviously he didn't play, so that means he didn't take one live rep in the preseason this year. So it's got to be a concern. But Doug Peterson has been consistent. He said it's not that big of an issue. They're being cautious. Nick insists. He talked after the game. He insists he's fine. He's okay. He's going to be ready. And we have to take him at their word at this point. And those are going to be your 2 quarterbacks, Carson Wentz and Nick Foles. There's no way Matt McGloin, if anything, he took a step back. I can't imagine this team would keep 3 quarterbacks, and I agree with you. I don't think that's going to happen.
What do you think happens with Donnell Pumphrey? Because I think Corey Clement, in my opinion, did enough to make this team. I don't know that they keep 5 running backs, so what happens to Pumphrey?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are going to keep 5 running backs now, and I think you're right. I think Clement outplayed him, beat him out, so to speak. But they're not going to cut a 4th-round pick, and they're going to sort of redshirt him on the back end of the roster. And he's going to be a guy who doesn't dress the entire season, and they'll revisit it next year. Hopefully he can gain some weight, be more prepared to play at the NFL level. But that's a concern. I think that's the weakest position on paper for this football team right now, because even though Corey outplayed Donnell Pumphrey, there's no question about that. It's not exactly like he's a high-level NFL runner. And you have your own concerns with LeGarrette Blount the only guy you can count on in this group is Darren Sproles. And he's a 34-year-old guy, and I've speculated that the Eagles, he's sort of like Nick Foles for an entirely different reason. He didn't play one down in a preseason game. Nobody cares because he's completely healthy. But I think that tells you something about the Eagles' mentality. If this is Darren Sproles' last year, and he's intimated retirement, although he's kind of pulled back on that and says he'll revisit it, there's no reason to go into the year with the same Darren Sproles mentality in that you have to save him. If this is it, this is it. And I think he might end up being the Eagles' bell cow back. They might use him, and because he's the one guy they can count on.
Yeah, there's no doubt Doug Peterson loves him, and for good reason. When you look at receiver, you talked about keeping fourth-round pick Pumphrey. What about fifth-round pick Shelton Gibson, who seems to also be very much so on the bubble?
Yeah, I agree with you, and it doesn't make a lot of sense from what I just said, but I think Shelton was outplayed by a number of players, so he's far down on the list to the point where I have the Eagles keeping 5 receivers. I think Marcus Johnson will be number 5. If you want to keep 6, which is a possibility, that would probably be Bryce Treggs. And even that, you could argue Greg Ward outplayed Shelton Gibson, and I would argue he did, and that would be number 7. So I think the mentality with Shelton Gibson is waive him, hope he gets through waivers, and put him on the practice squad.
Let's talk about Elijah Qualls, because Josh and I were talking about him before. I feel like he's been really consistent this preseason, and I like what he's brought. Where do you see him kind of fitting in on this team?
Yeah, I think he's going to make the team, and I think that's the deepest position. The defensive line as a whole for the Eagles, I think they're going to keep 10. He's going to be the 5th defensive tackle as a 6th-round rookie. He's really played well towards the tail end of the preseason. Struggled a bit. Remember, he's one of those Pac-12 guys that can't be here because of the NFL's graduation rules. So he missed a lot of the off-season work. He was behind a little bit, but you see his explosion. He's a really versatile guy, too. He's got a unique frame. He's sort of like a fire plug, but he's very, very quick. He can play 3 technique. He can play 0 technique on the nose. So he's got a lot of versatility, and the Eagles are looking really good there because now they have Bo Allen back as well. So they're going to have Bo Allen, who they like a lot, Destiny Vallejo, and Elijah Qualls are going to back up 2 very good starters in Fletcher Cox and Tim Jernigan.
Last one for me here before you go back to Josh, John. I wanted to ask you about today, going through the quote war room there as Howie and company are trying to figure out what they're doing with this roster. We all know Howie loves to make deals. We saw the Sheldon Richardson trade go down a little bit earlier today. Do you anticipate Howie maybe doing a deal here today or tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, Howie loves moves. There's no question about it. He probably saw the Sheldon Richardson trade, and they probably had to put him in a strap jacket because he was so excited by that. So, I mean, he sees other people moving pieces, and he's going to want to do that. I think ultimately, though, he's already made most of his trades. You never say never with him. Certainly, I think you're going to see some movement. So when you see him get down to 53 tomorrow at 4 o'clock, remember, that's not the end of it, because then you got to hit the waiver wire. Last year, the Eagles picked up 3 different players on waivers. So ultimately, we just talked about running back. I mean, this might be a great moment for Corey Clement, and he might make this final 53. As I said, ultimately, I think he does, but the Eagles might see something on the waiver wire they like better running back, and all of a sudden, he might be gone by Sunday. So it could be one of those types of issues.
John McMullen on 97.3 ESPN.com. Eagles Insider also covers the NFL for FanRag Sports. John, a couple of guys who I've seen this preseason I look at, I'm not fully sure if they're going to make the roster or not, so I'm going to run some names by you. So I thought Dylan Gordon did not look good last night. He got spun around way too many times for my taste. Do you think he makes the team?
Yeah, I agree. He looked terrible yesterday, and I was trying to not put him on my final 53-man roster, and I couldn't because there's nobody to replace him unless you want to go Taylor Hart or an undrafted free agent, Victor Salatko. I don't think either of those guys are ready. And remember, Dylan also has been the one guy who's lined up at fullback in the preseason. He played tight end at LSU before making the move to the offensive line, so he can line up there as an extra blocking tight end as well, so he's got some versatility. So ultimately, I think he makes that football team, but similar to what I said about Corey Clement, if you see something on the waiver wire, you have to look at it because the depth on the interior of the offensive line is still really good. But the depth we talked about outside is no longer really good after the trades of Alan Barber and Matt Tobin. And now, basically, you have Big V and Dylan Gordon, as you mentioned. Dylan looked really, really bad last night. So ultimately, I think he makes it, but because there's no other option at this point.
Another guy this preseason that I personally have kind of mixed reviews about is Joe Walker. I know how much the staff lauded him coming out of college. He was injured last year. Do you think that he makes the final 53 as one of the linebacker depth guys?
Yeah, I do. They do like him. I think it's still a work in progress coming back from the torn ACL, but you saw what he was able to do. He had the big hit on Josh McCown that scared Jets Nation. God forbid that Josh McCown goes down. So he was going to make this team last year when he tore his ACL, and I think he's shaping up as the backup to Jordan Hicks at middle linebacker. But to me, the interesting thing is if Jordan can't play, who's going to replace him in the lineup on game day? Because Jim Schwartz always talks about how you handle reps in training camp, but that's not necessarily what you do in a game week if you have to replace an important player. So I think the Eagles have some work to do as far as figuring out their backup linebacker situation and who they're most comfortable with in certain situations. But, yeah, I mean, Joe Walker's going to be on this football team.
A guy who I actually liked what I saw from him last night in this preseason overall, but I've been kind of unsure if he's going to make the team or not, C.J. Smith. I thought that he did some nice things last night, and I think he may have edged his way onto this roster.
Yeah, I mean, CJ's one of those guys I debated with. He's in a difficult position. Ultimately, I left him off, but it could go either way. Depending, I think the Eagles like Dexter McDougal enough that they're going to carry him on this football team. And then you have the three starters and Rasul Douglas, so that's five right there. Are you going to keep six corners? Ultimately, I do think they keep 10 defensive backs as a whole, but I had Jalen Watkins over C.J. Smith simply because he can play corner and he can play safety. Plus, if you look at who started the game, it was Jalen Watkins. So I think Jalen has kind of a leg up on C.J. Smith at this point.
I've heard from some people today their frustrations with Caleb Sturgis. Again, it's the kicker's not consistent enough, and then with David Akers getting into the Eagles Ring of Honor Hall of Fame, you kind of have to think, man, it's actually been since David Akers this team has actually had a truly reliable kicker. You look at Caleb Sturgis, you look around the league, though, there's a lot of teams that don't have consistency at kicker. You kind of have to wonder if Sturgis doesn't have a solid year this year, that this may be his last year in Philadelphia, right, John?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that could always be for any kicker. I mean, you don't have to go back far. Cody Parkey was an all-pro kicker for 1 year, and then he got hurt, and then he was gone. And that's how quickly it can happen with kickers. I don't have much concern over Caleb Sturgis. I don't think by any means is he Justin Tucker or anyone of that nature. but I think he's good enough. And in training camp, you have to remember, the Eagles had John Dornbos here. They had, obviously, Rick Lovato. They went with Lovato. They also have brought in Cameron Johnston as a backup punter. That means you're dealing with different long snappers, different holders at different times of the game. And that kind of stuff is what people don't think about, but that can have a great effect on a kicker. I always point to Blair Walsh. You remember with the Vikings, he missed that 27-yard field goal in the playoffs, and he was run out of town. He was another all-pro kicker. And his career turned around when they switched holders, and he just had no confidence in his holder. That can affect kickers. And I think ultimately when you get that battery together, it'll be Lovato, Donnie Jones, and Caleb Sturgis. I think you'll see the consistency kind of tick up in the regular season.
John, some notes from around the NFL. You cover the NFL for FanRag Sports. You can follow John online at JF McMullen on Twitter. John, the big news of the day has been, at least on the transaction front, the Jets trading Sheldon Richardson to the Seahawks for Jermaine Kearse and a second-round pick. We heard rumors yesterday that the Seahawks are open to trading Jermaine Kearse, but I don't think anybody expected them to get Sheldon Richardson. There's probably at least 10 teams, John, around the league. You would think they're saying, what we could have had Sheldon Richardson too?
Well, I don't know about that. Obviously, you can't dispute the talent. And if you look at that Seahawks front, it's pretty scary now when you add Sheldon Richardson to the mix. But he has been kind of a knucklehead. The Jets have been trying to get out of the Sheldon Richardson business for a long time now. So you do have that aspect of it. But I will say on paper, as I said, I mean, we might as well not play this season because showing up in Minneapolis in February, it's going to be the Patriots and the Seahawks. I mean, if you think about Sheldon Richardson added to Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill and Frank Clark in that front seven and Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright, it is unbelievable on paper. So we'll see how it shakes out. But to add that kind of talent to that defense, that's pretty good.
Other news, John, from around the league, we're seeing a ton of transactions going on. You know, it's one of those deals where because of the cuts coming tomorrow, we know that teams are kind of preparing for the inevitable of 1,200 guys all being available. One of the moves that may affect depth charts is Martavius Bryant is now being cleared to participate in the regular season games and practices with the Steelers. So how does he impact, you think, the Steelers' 53-man roster?
Well, I mean, the Steelers, you think about where they were last season without Bryant and the fact that they were as close as they were. And as I said, Le'Veon Bell was going to come in right before the regular season. Here it is, September 1st. He magically shows up. And they got a chance to be the best offense in football. And they're certainly going to be in the top 2 or 3. And it's even going to get it's even going to get better from where it was last season. So if you are looking for a team that could possibly knock off the Patriots on the AFC side, it's probably going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers. And having him there, obviously, it makes it easier. And the fact that, you know, what do you do? Obviously, Antonio Brown is the guy you got to concern yourself the most when you're defending the Steelers. So now that you have Bryant and Ben Roethlisberger back together again, it's going to be that much more difficult to stop the Steelers.
John, the big picture NFL news story has been the situation with Ezekiel Elliott. The news came out last night that Roger Goodell was never even talked to Tiffany Thompson. He didn't listen to the recommendations of 2 different people who were advising them that they wouldn't have suspended Ezekiel Elliott. Now the NFLPA files the injunction saying if the ruling is upheld that, you know, they want to make sure that, you know, he's still able to play. But of course, Harold Henderson still has to come back Monday or Tuesday and tell us what exactly his ruling is. So the saga continues in Dallas, John.
Yeah, and I've been saying that. I said people jumped the gun saying Ezekiel Elliott wasn't going to be there week one. All this indicates is that the NFLPA believes that the suspension will be upheld at 6 games. It likely will be. So they're going to take it to federal court, try to get a stay, and we go through the same rigmarole we've done in many different cases over the years. Ultimately, the NFL will win in the end. However, Ezekiel Elliott's probably not going to be suspended, possibly if he gets a stay for this entire season. So you could be talking about this suspension next year instead of this year. But ultimately, you know, all the stuff you just mentioned about Roger Goodell being part of the investigation, that's just trying to win in the court of public opinion. That means nothing from a legal standpoint, because the only thing they're going to be arguing once they get into this court case is, does the NFL have the right to suspend Ezekiel Elliott in the collective bargaining agreement? Do they have the power to do that? And the answer is yes. It has nothing to do with whether he committed domestic violence or not. They're not going to relitigate the case. It's not about saying Ezekiel Elliott's right, the NFL's wrong. It's an employment law case, and the NFL will win because the NFLPA gave it that power in collective bargaining.
John, sort of as a follow-up to all that, how do you think the Cowboys are feeling about all this? You know, would they like to just see Zeke, whatever comes down with the ruling on the suspension, just take it and get it over with? Or do you get the sense they're behind him to take this fight on?
Well, they've been behind him, and that was part of the strategy. And I also talked about that's what you have to weigh. He's a 22-year-old kid, so you can say, I'd always said maybe if you could get it knocked down from 6 games to 4 games, you say, okay, let's get it over with. Let's get him for the 3 quarters of the season on the back end and move forward. But they've made their decision by filing the lawsuit, and this is the way they want to go. So ultimately, they're trying to get him probably for this entire season and try to make a run towards the Super Bowl. But ultimately, as I said, the Cowboys know better than anyone else. Jerry Jones is one of the most powerful owners in this league. He knows the NFL is going to win in the end. They always win in the end because the courts, people have to realize, if they ruled in Ezekiel Elliott's favor, it would have ramifications far outside the world of football. It would render every single CBA in this country, in any industry, up for debate. And they're never going to do that.
John, before we let you go, I want to end on a positive note. J.J. Watt is up to $15.4 million in his fundraising efforts. Meanwhile, Arnold Schwarzenegger has put out a video encouraging people to get behind J.J. Watt. So what is your over-under on how much J.J. Watt can fundraise at this point?
Yeah, I mean, what did he want to start out? It's amazing how far it's gone, and the fact that everyone's gotten behind it. I can't even give you an over/under because I'm stunned at the number they got to that they're out right now. But as I mentioned yesterday on the show, people kind of harp on the bad things all the time in this league, and Ezekiel Elliott would be the most obvious case of that right now. But the vast majority of guys in this league do so much community work. They don't get in trouble. And nobody talks about it. And I always think that part of it's kind of sad.
He is John McMullen. You can follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen. He's our 97.3 ESPN.com Eagles insider. Also covers the NFL for FanRag Sports. John, everybody's off on Monday, so you won't have to hear from me that day.
Oh, I'm going to miss you, Josh.
It's just one day, so don't miss me too much.
Happy Labor Day. Happy Labor Day.
Happy Labor Day weekend, John. We know you'll be working.
Always.